We'll start the afternoon with our panel discussion. And this panel discussion will be led by Kris Rush, again, our technical director here at the SCI. And then our next presentation will follow. So let's just get right into this. Go ahead, Kris. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining us. I'd be remiss if I didn't start off my opportunity to speak today by thanking Rhonda, Nicole, Dan, Bob Rosenstein, and the rest of the SEI staff who've made this possible. It's taken a lot of work to put this together, and also to thank our panelists and our speakers. So again, my greatest thanks. So in that regard, I think all of the speakers should be fairly familiar at this point, although we do have at least one who will be speaking after the panel. But by way of introduction, let me first introduce myself. My name is Christopher Rush. I'm one of the technical directors at the CERT program, or part of the CERT division at the Software Engineering Institute. Part of my work is in working with Tim Morrow and Nicole and Rhonda and team, working on security architectures and helping the government, the Department of Defense, and the broader security community come to terms with the implications of technological advancements relative to network infrastructure, as well as to take advantage of the benefits that provides, and wrestle with some of the challenges that it also presents. So that being said, I'll just run through the names really quick, and then we can dive into a set of questions. We're going to take audience questions and participation as well. And I'm happy to let the panelists kind of take the conversation where it may go. So joining us today, we have Mark Allers from SimCore. We have Marty Fabry, who will speak later from Zentera. We have Philip Griffiths, who spoke earlier from NetFoundry. And we also have Bob Smith joining us from Zscaler. So, gentlemen, I think we've said a lot. We've seen a lot today. There's been a lot to discuss. It's an on.
Kevin Kump is also on the panel. I'm not sure.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I'd be remiss in not acknowledging all of our panelists. I was reading from my script. So thank you, Kevin, for joining rather. We do appreciate it. Kevin is joining us from Siolo. Am I saying that correctly?
You're on mute, Kevin.
Yeah, correct, Chris. Thank you. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin will be speaking later today as well. So again, this is the second industry day. Every one of us here has been a part of this broader thing that we've all determined to be a journey, maybe not so much a discrete destination. And we bring a lot to the table in terms of perspective, opportunities to have engaged with any number of customers and clients and partners to help understand their requirements and help bring to bear the zero trust principles that we've spent a lot of time talking about today. So I'll start by teeing up with probably a softball before we maybe get into some meatier matters and topics for discussion. But I'd like to maybe hear from each of you what some of the challenges, the greatest challenges that you've faced when helping clients and partners implement zero trust. And if there's any, I'd like to also hopefully discern whether or not there's some center of gravity around the types of challenges we see when we're engaging with our partners. I'm simply going to go in my Hollywood Squares box of Zoom and start off in the top left, my top left, and I'll turn it over to Bob for a couple minutes of discussion.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think it's the traditional ones you would think of. When you look at a lot of any kind of net new technology, net new paradigm that's being introduced in an environment, the challenges are always the layer 8 and layer 9 scenarios, right? Layer 8 being people, layer 9 being politics and culture in the organization. And what I've seen is like the biggest barrier is, there's, especially in the, in the federal space, right? There's this resistance to change, resistance to doing something different. And especially if you're going to a net new technology like zero trust, where you're no longer placing people on the network. A lot of people feel threatened by that because, hey, I'm a traditional network guy, right? I'm a traditional firewall guy, and you're threatening my paradigm of how things get done in an organization. So we see that. The other,
Make it quiet, please.
huh? What was it? I'm sorry, Kevin.
I'm sorry. No, I was,
No worries.
Yep.
And then the other one is the layer, the layer 9 situation where, the culture of the organization might not be ready for change, where people are rolling something out and they didn't get it, they didn't get the appropriate buy-ins from, from different groups in the organization. So I've seen that before where we get ready to implement and, oh, we never got security's buy-in. We never got this group's buy-in. And now we kind of have to start from square one again to start the whole process again because some key group or individual in the organization wasn't, fully read in on what was transpiring in the organization. So I'd open up the rest of the panel, see what your experiences have been for the rest of the panel.
All right. So that takes us to Marty. What challenges have you maybe seen your partners encounter?
I definitely agree with Bob's comments. I mean, those are very, very real challenges. I'll throw in one interesting one that is always a fun challenge. It's when there are multiple IT departments that need to talk, basically inter-organizational collaboration or some sort of interaction of sorts. And it poses not only, those people challenges, like Bob mentioned, but also various technical challenges when it comes to connecting networks. People try to brute force things of that nature, but then they create security challenges. Of course, nobody wants to open up any part of their own network to any third party, whether it be a vendor or customer or partner. Those definitely pose some interesting challenges, especially with legacy approaches. Those legacy approaches to collaboration definitely create friction, take a long time to implement, and just shouldn't have to be.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Philip.
Yeah, a slightly different angle. One of the ones which I enjoy most and see quite frequently is when people say zero trust has nothing to do with technology. It is all to do with the culture and the processes. To which I always think, would you throw a Mustang versus an F-35? Like they're both fighter jets. They both have weapons on. They both fly, but they have very different capabilities, and it is important to understand how the principles of zero trust interplay into them, which I think is I think this is very important where things like the zero trust maturity model 2.0 come in, because it enables you to start thinking not just like everyone goes, oh, I'm zero trust, this is zero trust, that's zero trust, and then you get people saying, oh, zero trust is bunk. It's not. It's just people are using the word and they're not defining enough as to how are they delivering zero trust? What is the maturity level and the capabilities that they're meeting? And I think it behooves us as technologists to both talk about the layer 8 and 9 aspects as Bob was talking about, but then also being able to distinguish how the technology differs. Because let's be honest, if anyone was at RSA last week, everyone's going, hey, we were zero trust. We'll sell you some zero trust. And making it as simple and crystal clear for people, to the users and the buyers, to understand, well, how is this zero trust different to this zero trust or this other technology? I think is crucially important to deliver success.
I can't endorse those words enough. I thank you for saying them. I find that to be a great challenge, and I may take liberties with my next question, teeing up from that.
Hey, Kris, real quick, I'll answer a couple here if we're going through. From challenges, the one that I see the most, that I hear the most, and I'm deeply involved in right now is while 800.207 is out there and the ZTA and ZTA architecture is kind of defined, it still is open to interpretation, meaning that there are no prescriptive controls defining ZT So that leaves everyone, when we talk about NIST or, White House initiatives, DOD, DISA, CISA, DHS, IEEE. I mean, everyone's interpreting zero trust to meet their own objectives. One of my biggest fears and problems actually stems and comes out of NIST with the NCCOE participants. Given ZTA is a new architecture and 853 doesn't even have some controls defined to meet the objectives of ZTA, we're finding square pegs in round holes. So we got 24 participants that are involved in the NCCOE Zero Trust initiative. It prohibits and stifles innovation because everyone's trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. This is a whole new strategy and it's a whole new architecture. Are there technologies that can be used and supplement? Absolutely. But if you look at all the controls that are necessary to fulfill a ZTA, if you combine CIS controls, 853 controls, and controls from ISO, there's a gap of about 15% of controls. So that's probably one of the biggest ones. And then I think Bob hit on the other one, the culture. I see it from kind of a multitude of fronts. And one of the biggest cultural problems, in my opinion, and I come from an IT ops background, and I mean we're speaking with folks at the birthplace of DevSecOps. Security and ops have got to come together. We got to stop this us versus them. I mean, I look at the vulnerability management. Why does security have to go run the scan and turn it over to ops and say, hey, go patch these systems? And there's so many of those scenarios. Where does the security fit, in my opinion, these days? It's at the authentication layers. It's the giving the right people the right access to the right information at the right time. That's where security, all the workload stuff should be over on the ops side of the equation. They have the process. They know how to deliver. Those are my two biggest things that I hear from the industry. And I just gave an interview on last week at RSA about this very, very topic of devs, bringing together dev and security and ops.
No, that's extremely insightful, and I agree wholeheartedly, and thank you for those comments. I think we're going to circle back here with my next question after we give Kevin the opportunity to talk to maybe dig deeper into that. Kevin?
So I think there's two terms out there that the industry has become eye roll terms, and those are ZT anything, ZTA, ZTNA, and AI. And these are things that people are now out there saying, I will help you with your AI. I will certify you with your ZT implementation. And yet when we hear the comments here about these are frameworks, these are best practices, these are things you should do, it doesn't drive the compliance because they're not being audited and tied to it. It doesn't drive the risk revenue reduction for them. And they think it's an ambiguous, nebulous term because as an industry, everybody's jumped on the bandwagon. And when you take it from that perspective and say, if we break down the parts, do the sum of the parts for what we're doing here with zero trust, be it version 1, version 2, or in the future, truly add security. They do. But the problem is in the industry is that we've pushed them as such the panacea, the cure-all. It's like me telling you, if you eat your fruits and vegetables every single day, you're going to get stronger and healthier. And you don't know what the mix and the blend is to be proper for your own diet and your own body. So I think that's where we've done a disservice. And I think we really have to focus on the education and value benefits, not the terminology, as these industry has really become.
No, that's an important set of insights as well, and thank you. So this takes me to kind of the next question, which didn't start out as my next question, but here I am. So we talk a lot about the principles of zero trust, applying zero trust principles, yet we're faced in reality with applying a set of concrete things to systems and networks to achieve security. One of the things I heard earlier was, around things like metrics. Philip and Mark talked about, as well as you, Kevin, about kind of these abstract terms, for, principles and, what the words meant relative to application. And so I wonder, how do we, in a vendor agnostic, a solution agnostic way, ideally kind of agreeing on some sort of common taxonomy for what we consider to represent the principles of zero trust, how do we take that to something where we can observe, evaluate, and measure using hard metrics that are comparable across solutions, between vendors, between networks? And how does one reason about those metrics, relative to determining their progress on their zero trust journey, as well as using those same metrics to evaluate the efficacy or the effectiveness of their chosen implementation? So, small question, I'll throw it out there. Bob?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially if you're trying to do it in the paradigm of how do we collectively, because I can measure things, from my world and my perspective and say, well, here's what success looks like for my customer base. But to your point, how do I anonymize it? I guess, or genericize it to apply to everyone, right? And it's a tough question because I think every vendor has a tendency to kind of look at the world through their glass, right? I see everything through obviously the Zscaler lens. Mark probably sees things through the SimCore lens and so on, right? One of the things that we're trying to do, at least here, is to have quarterly meetings with our customers and say, hey, here's your progress so far. Here are the number of threats we've blocked, things along those lines, where we have, hard metrics, to your point, where, hey, here are the things that we stopped in the cloud. Here are the number of threats that we saw that were going to land on your desktop, but we were able to block that in real time and stop that in the cloud. And that helps, to a certain degree with those hard metrics. But yeah, trying to take that and saying, well, what does my metrics look like compared to everybody else's is a challenge. And I'm trying to think of like a good way of answering that, because I think to Mark's point, when we were trying to do these collaborative efforts with other groups like at NIST and NCCOE, getting everybody to sit in a room and kind of agree on their framework and what they want to showcase, because everybody's trying to jockey for position and put the best foot forward for their own organization. It does become a challenge. I think it is confusing to our customer base, right? I think it can be confusing to customers. I think if we're trying to do our customers a service, we really should talk about, the overarching architecture and say, hey, here are things that are going to need to change in your environment. If you're not putting people on the network anymore, for example, whether it's us, whether it's anybody, right? If we're not attaching a network to a network layer and you're trying to do a vulnerability scan, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for your organization now if you can't scan those endpoints because their endpoints aren't really technically on the network anymore, right? So I've got to change my architecture to kind of, fit this paradigm, this new paradigm, and this new architecture.
No, thank you. The other thing I'll add for consideration amongst other panels is, I think, as you said, right, we've got this legacy of prior metrics that were used to evaluate security posture, efficacy, effectiveness, that we're trying to apply to the current state of play relative to zero trust. And I also think the other complicating function or factor is that, while the government has, DoD, federal civilian, has more or less set the mandate to implement and achieve zero trust, they haven't prescribed the solution. And because they haven't prescribed the solution, you've got everybody in the marketplace choosing their own solution. And then that brings us back to, as you were describing, Bob, how do you compare solution A to solution 4? And it's almost impossible. So that being said, Marty, I'd be curious to hear your perspective.
Sure. So I think there are probably well, there are lots of questions in your question, of course, but from the perspective of when you're deploying, when you're already undertaking the journey, right? And you want to see, okay, have I progressed? Have I made a dent? I think some of our experience with the report generation for CISOs may be of interesting guidance. For example, InfoSec people or IT operations folks may be interested in very deep level of detail. They may need to they may need to worry about all sorts of SOC dashboards and whatnot. But when we're talking about high level metrics, I think it's important to understand, okay, what is my level of protection? How much have I locked down? What maybe peeling the onion a little bit further. What have I specifically locked down? What aspects are my users using these tools? If I am in the journey, that means I'm in the transition from some legacy to the new architecture. How much is it actually used? How much is it actually protecting? What is still exposed? So if it can be summarized in something that an executive can be comfortable reading and presenting and getting an update on a weekly basis, I think that's something that would probably make it digestible for judging how a solution is really doing its job.
No, thank you. Philip?
Yeah, it struck me as you were talking. I laughed to myself because you even admit it's not a simple problem. It's an incredibly complex one. And I think what Bob was mentioning around the groups is very crucial, because the metrics which matter to an organization depends upon what industry they're in, what type of organization they are. That said, I actually did touch on a little bit in my presentation that I think, broadly speaking, the two kind of major metrics are: how does it impact the user experience and outcome, and how does it impact operational resiliency? You can break that into subsectors, such as how much of the MITRE attack framework do we stop, or how much harder or longer is it to execute or disrupt the cyber kill chain or flow. And so I think, and this was what was coming into my head as you were posing the question and others were talking about it, what it really requires is to have the type of end organizations, DoD or DHS or manufacturing company, Acme, in those forums where they can really articulate, these are the KPIs, these are the metrics which most matter to our business, so that you can start to consolidate those across many different industry types, and to be able to therefore build a set of generic or potentially industry specific metrics that we therefore want to judge zero trust against. Because ultimately, if it's not driving the business outcomes, if it's not delivering business value, then there's always going to be questions asked at that layer 8 and 9 level. And so I guess the request from the industry side, because as others alluded to, we're happy to come into the forums and go, "Oh, our solution's best. That's what you want." But it is incredibly useful to understand from the actual customers themselves as to what they see as success and how we can build up that sort of measurable and testable view of deploying zero trust to a mature and advanced level.
No, thank you. Mark?
Yeah, so if we're based on this particular questions on metrics and KPIs, I like to keep it simple. Corporate America and the government have two different sets. Corporate America is all about mitigation of risk and cost reductions as they balance one another, and government is about saving lives and protecting valuable information, whether it's confidentiality, should I say. So the two drive two different decisions and how they're going to get from point A to point B. I often say security is the mission, compliance is the outcome. And in today's world right now, all the CISOs have kind of thrown their hands up and said, I'm done. I've done everything I thought I could, or I've been educated or read about to, change the metrics of security breaches and incidences. Now I'm just fed up. I'm like I said, 80% on average of everyone that's probably on this in an audience has already been breached or is breached right now. So that just drives the CISOs to turn to the compliance and say, you know what, I'm going to leave it up to them to tell us what we need to do. And so now we're starting to see this compliance driving kind of the solution sets. Well, compliance can't drive zero trust because they have no measurable controls to be able to say you're doing this either inbounds or out of bounds, because you can't audit what you can't monitor and measure. So what I'm afraid of is we're going to go through this problem like we've seen with CMMC. We're going to see version 1, version 2, and it's just going to, that's my worry. When in fact, this is solvable, but we have to have the right minds come together and not have 12 different groups, saying, hey, this is what my zero trust looks like, and this is what my architecture looks like. We're going to fail miserably again if we do that. Miserably. So that's my 2 cents.
So I'll pose a follow-up, and then I'll go back to you, Kevin, if you don't mind. So from your vantage point, right, the very big problem that you posed or ended on, what's the answer? How do you bring together a disparate set of entities with potentially different and possibly overlapping motivations?
So I think if you look at it in the way that you would build a house, and I'm being very serious here, if you do not set that first block of the foundation properly, everything on top of that is going to have problems in the future. And we're throwing out regulations, we're throwing out edicts, mandates, thou shalt do this, without connective tissue to say, what does good look like? We have to go back to the mindset of security away from compliance and saying, if you look at the foundational asks across any of the standards out there, across any of the things that have come out across government, private sector, insurance industry, where they're taking a bath for having to prevent ransomware and pay for it, it's really coming down to, we all know that you need strong authentication. We all know that you need basically your software to be built and checked for code flaws and mitigation. We all know what good architecture looks like and what best practices for firewall management and everything as you go up the ladder are. It's building that defense in depth is the only way you're going to extract the principles. Because if you do your proper defense in depth, if you do your proper structure, the only difference that you really come down to in many of these when you read it is the rigor of your auditing and logging and compliance. It's not one saying we do MFA today and another saying you should not do MFA. We have those foundation principles. We need to go back and build the house and say, everybody, here's the way we properly build this, and please get on board and start from here. Throwing them more legislation or edicts is just another on the pile of, I'm confused, I need cross mappings and crosswalks. I think that's where we have to start, the foundations.
No, that's a good set of observations, and again, it's going to cause me to pivot my questioning to a different question. So it's a multi-part question, as I think all of them have been to date. So kind of pick and choose which parts of it you answer. But one of the things I heard, certainly from you, Kevin, was the disparity between the mandates and the frameworks, that exist to date, and they're coming from everywhere, right? You're seeing it out of DoD within the services. You're seeing it within the DIB. You're seeing it with DHS and their federal civilian agencies, and never mind the private sector. So I guess the couple of questions all tied up in one is really, do the mandates and the guidance that exists to date, have they helped or hurt? And to the degree that they have been helpful, what are some of the most helpful aspects of those mandates and guidelines that exist that people should really lean on? And where there's weaknesses, what are the missing components of the current guidance and frameworks that we might need to focus on or spend more time on to better prepare and equip, all those communities to implement zero trust. So I'll go back to Bob, square one.
Yeah. No, I think it's been a mixed bag, right? I mean, I think it has the mandates have helped, for certain aspects, right? I look at M2209 and the original mandate, it's been out for multiple years saying, hey, we should get rid of these legacy VPNs. We shouldn't be putting people on these exposed VPN concentrators that are, obviously a vulnerability. And then what happened? Some agencies took that to heart and went down that path, and others didn't, and then they got exposed with the Avanti situation, right? There was a mad scramble for a lot of customers, kind of across the board, to figure out like, what am I going to do now, right? I had, CISA gave 24 to 48 hours to remedy that, and it was a big security hole for not only federal customers but commercial customers as well. So I think if people had taken that to heart earlier, maybe a number of situations could have gotten addressed. And I think some of the gaps are definitely around, at least what we're seeing is around logging, because, we go to customers and they're saying, well, I've got these mandates around logging, and they're treating logging as though it was on the traditional network, and they're not accounting for, the cloud and saying, okay, well, I want all these PCAPs and I want all the detailed logs that I get on a traditional network. And it's like, well, you can have it, but it's going to be a massive cost for your cloud storage and to stream these logs to your environment. Do you really want this? And working with agencies like CISA and other, regulatory compliance agencies, I think they're starting to massage some of those requirements to say, okay, yeah, you're right. This was not well framed in the discussion on what we originally intended. The intent was well, but it wasn't really well thought out on how they framed the actual use case, right? So it's like, so now they're trying to walk that back a little bit and say, hey, here's what we really mean when we say these are the required logs that we need from a federal perspective, at least. So I think it's been a mixed bag. I mean, I think, like I said, it has helped. And the other thing I think, that I find interesting, when we talk about these compliance and regulatory requirements, is the burden that this puts on the private industry. Because if you're a private company and you're trying to meet all these different regulatory requirements, and they're all disparate regulatory requirements, the cost of doing each and every one of these becomes at a certain point exorbitant. And it's like, now we have to try to pass those costs on to consumers. And it's just like, okay, well, why does it cost so much? It's like, well, we've got to meet this standard, this standard, this standard, this standard. It requires a lot of time and money and effort from a private perspective. So I don't know, Kris, if that answers your question, but I mean, that's kind of, what I'm kind of seeing when I talk to my customers, the two sides of the argument, the benefits and the detriments that we're kind of running into from our perspective.
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, no wrong answers here. I mean, these are big questions, right? That's the intent, is to try to wrestle with some of the bigger sort of open-ended things. So thank you. Marty, what are your thoughts relative to kind of, mandates and frameworks, and what role they've played, and maybe what role they should be playing relative to the kind of open questions amongst the different communities of interest? You're on mute.
Thank you. So I think some of the biggest benefits or biggest positives of these mandates is that it starts movement. It starts people thinking, introspecting, evaluating where they're at. It starts the conversation at the board level or at the executive level. And more practically, it also initiates or helps initiate various exercises within the organizations, practices and techniques that have been in place for decades. People start critically analyzing, thinking, doing exercises, trying to pen test, things of that nature that actually start taking place. Also, I think it was a previous comment that with the culture or the momentum of culture that's sort of very difficult to break, a government mandate helps the InfoSec teams say, well, hey, hold on, it's not just me out of the beauty of conversation that I'm trying to ask you to change your ways. This is actually something that is needed because of XYZ mandates or because of instructions from the top, so to say. So I think it empowers the IT organizations to start taking actions which they would have otherwise had tied hands.
So I'll pose a follow-up, and then the remaining panelists can consider this also. So I think we can generally agree that there's lots of benefit to, mandates and guidance and frameworks. Is there a risk to what I would describe potentially as arbitrary deadlines for compliance? And by risk, I mean, is there a risk of rushing to meet a deadline, calling it a win, when perhaps it's only a partial implementation or it's incomplete, and then moving on because you've met the standard of compliance?
It's a follow-up to me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's definitely risk that we just check the boxes, just like the conversation about compliance and regulation checkboxes, right? I think one of the themes at RSA last week was actually from the zero trust leadership in the government, was that they're trying to frame it more as a conversation, as a sort of a fruitful introspection, fruitful conversation about what needs to be done, and starting to take actions, seeking out guidance. And I think, or as opposed to sort of being under the stick, being or else type of scenario. Having that as a conversation, or having that be part of the culture, that, okay, yes, there's a deadline, but if you tell us what you're doing, or if you show us progress, or if you show us what your thought processes are, maybe that can help alleviate some of these pressures or risks of sort of the checkbox driven compliance. Those are some thoughts that come to mind.
No, thank you. Philip.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, and particularly with that added on question, I think there is potentially risk. But again, from project management background, you always have the work doesn't get done until it's really due, and then people work on it. And I've seen in defense contractors, for example, when they know we need to be compliant by this date, therefore we need to start working now, because otherwise our customer will not buy our solution if it's not compliant. It really provides a forcing function. If I look at the mandates and the guidance, I reiterate what Marty was just saying. They've really provided an impetus where people are prioritizing security more than necessarily have in the past. But the biggest problem I think that we have, both in this area but also just generally, is there's no real liability for vendors. I can sell you a piece of software, my license goes, it's not my problem anymore. And without either you solve that problem by you mandate actually you are liable, therefore vendors have to make themselves more secure by default, or you effectively use the purchasing power of the government to say, you know what, from X date, not only are we going to tell our departments and government ministries that they have to be compliant, but also then they have to pass that burden on to their customers, so that you provide a forcing function for the private sector to make sure their products are compliant, because ultimately this is how you make change. You either reduce cost and risk, or you generate a profit incentive, and people will therefore be compliant to these things. This is why, in our belief, like, it's so important to develop a zero trust networking technology that can just be built into other things, because then everything can be delivered. Like, it's not just, hey, IT have to buy this. It's the OT equipment, it's the manufacturing equipment, it's the smart city equipment. It's everything can have zero trust networking principles and secure by default just built into it, so that the liability and responsibility doesn't just fall on the consumer organization.
No, those are very interesting points, and I think will ultimately need to be reconciled, right? Where the blame lies and who's ultimately responsible should the solutions fail is long been an open question. solved differently in different countries even. So it'll be interesting to see where that moves forward. I think potentially in part driven by things like the insurance market and cyber insurance and things of that nature as well. Mark, moving on to you, your thoughts on compliance, regulation, mandates, frameworks, and are they hurtful, helpful, and what are the implications of them?
Both. The answer is both to this. I look at the world as a bunch of carrots and sticks, right? 14028 was definitely a stick, and it was a mandate. I believe it was a good one, but the kind of to the pros and the cons of this, the downside to this is while the mandate was put out there, 14028, and it made its reference to 800-207, it wasn't prescriptive in nature, so there's a lot of interpretation. So when a mandate's been given, then people are, and I'm going to use Kevin's analogy of a house. That's my background. I'm a construction engineer of all things, believe it or not. You can't start, building a roof without the foundation, number one. But with all of these frameworks, some frameworks are very specific to a roof. Some are very specific to concrete. Some are very specific to maybe the HVAC and electrical. And so you're having to pull various componentries out of frameworks. At the end of the day, 85% of all frameworks are the same damn frameworks. They just have different verbiage, vernacular, nomenclature, numbering systems. They're all basically the same, but they're just off. And so I kind of feel like, and I use a lot of sports analogies. The goalposts are being moved. It's not that the goalposts are being moved relative to at the end of the end zone between the sidelines. Some goalposts are actually out of the stadium, and some are up actually in the stands. And so no one truly knows and understands how to get, you run into the end zone and you do it within the boundaries of the sidelines. That's great. And that gives some flexibility because you can't do everything as mandated by X, Y, and Z. But the sidelines can't be a mile wide, or else it's going to have too much interpretation. And then the frameworks they're not going to be conducive to the actual compliance mandate itself.
No, thank you. Kevin, you want to wrap up that question?
Sure. So to use the analogy that Mark had about the sports and the goalposts, I think the vendors, the contractors, and even the entities within the government have learned how to play the game. Meaning I've worked for entities that we knew Telnet needed to be disabled, and SSH replaced it at a given date. They were on a 5-year contract. They built into that contract the fines and penalties because they knew that we're not going to achieve this in our time, and we're not going to be here basically after that contract. So let the next person deal with it. Same thing with incident response. You have given periods of reporting now. They'll look and say, I have to know 48 hours, 72 hours of a breach of privacy information. Their legal process internally to determine if it was a breach might be 2+ weeks. They build that in and say, how many are we going to have this year? And then it's a profit center of, hey, we didn't have as many, we made money. So to the points here about there has to be value in this, there has to be truly negative impacts. If, as you said, DHS shows up and then TSA shows up and then somebody else shows up, who takes them importantly enough to say which one is the priority? And we're basically now just enabling the problem of, with so many out there, I know I'm not going to reach them all. I'm just going to take the gamble out there and find a way to profit from this. And it's sad, but it's true.
No, those are good points. And I think there definitely is a risk of, taking advantage of a situation relative to, government mandates and frameworks, from the commercial sector, and that, given a strict timeline for implementation, there is a need to go to the marketplace, right? And so there's a competition of ideas and solutions, and someone's going to get picked. And we hope that from our vantage point, the SEI, the government, and our partners are educated enough and that the information is clear enough for them to understand, the parameters and to make the choice that they think that they are making, relative to just, spinning the wheel.
Hey, Chris, can I inject one more comment here? Because this question that you pose here is not just an arbitrary question. It's the same question that I was asked 3 weeks ago when I was at the White House, and it was one of the reasons I was brought in to the Office of the National Cybersecurity Director. Is that 14028 was mandated. The question that he posed was, where are the pitfalls, right? And the pitfalls are really coming in. You got all the disparate organizations are interpreting everything. And, the question becomes, how do you turn that mandate into actionable and positive, and achievable goals? One of my responses was to the White House was, stop having all of the single entities of DoD, DISA, CISA, DHS, and bring one common group together. Bring no more than 2 individuals from each one of those organizations, and come together and define what this needs to look like, set the objective of the controls, agree to them. Now, maybe there's different levels, like CMMC, it could be level 3. DoD, I'm sure, would be level 3 because of some of the requirements that they have with some of the big, Lockheeds and Raytheons of the world. But it can't be operating in all these discrete silos, or we're going to fail.
No, I agree fully. So I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction for what's probably my last question, and then ultimately I hope to give each of you a moment to kind of convey kind of your final thoughts as well. But the next question is really around a lot of what I heard this morning and I've heard elsewhere, around the application of zero trust in OT, right? OT, I would say, has really become common parlance in the last 5 years or so. I mean, we obviously know it's been around for decades, but I hear it as part of the conversation much more than I did in the past. It sounded like what I was hearing here and elsewhere is that, zero trust is not necessarily ready-made for OT environments. And I struggle a little bit with fully understanding that statement or idea, because inevitably, and in most cases, OT intersects with IT. Even if we have non-traditional, non-IP based infrastructure that we're characterizing as OT, and that could be manufacturing, critical infrastructure, healthcare, it could be space, right? We protect satellites. There is a point of demarcation where it does touch traditional networks typically. And so I wonder, is it that truly it just isn't applicable to OT, or is there a better way that we should be thinking about it such that we can take advantage of the protections and benefits of zero trust in environments or components of our network that don't at first blush appear to be a ready fit for zero trust? It's a big question, but it's one I'm quite interested in, and I think a lot of people struggle with. So, Bob, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. One of the biggest hurdles that I've seen is, like we just acquired air gap networks. I think that's a interesting technology to solve some of that problem, segment out some of these devices in the network and provide some form of a zero trust environment for these operational systems. But I think one of the challenges I see is that at the end of the day, these OT devices, unlike a user, they don't call a help desk, they don't blow up somebody's phone, they don't pound their fist on a desk and say, "Oh, I need to be protected." Unlike if an executive has a poor performance experience or somebody else has a bad day, they're going to blow up a help desk. And where I'm going with that is, because there's not enough noise, I think, around this to drive companies to be willing to spend more revenue on it, to kind of lock these systems down. And I do worry that we're going to reach a point where, we're going to have another Colonial Pipeline or some other event like that where people have ignored it because they haven't been able to justify the cost for securing these systems effectively. And, unlike like traditional users, right? That's an easy one to kind of justify and say, oh yeah, I'm going to protect my users, because if I don't, my phone's going to blow up and somebody's going to be, standing in front of my desk the next morning when a bad event happens. But with these other devices and systems, right? That's just, until something bad happens, I think it's going to be business as usual until we have another Colonial Pipeline event or something major like that, where we have another major ransomware. But we are seeing a major uptick in that too, right? I mean, we are seeing what I think was like a 200 or more percent increase in ransomware attacks, against IoT and OT devices last year. So I think the threat actors are becoming more and more aware this is a methodology to extract funds from organizations. So,
No, thank you. Marty, do you have thoughts on sort of that OT challenge? Mute.
Thank you. So the OT environment definitely poses a lot of different types of challenges when it comes to networking or infrastructure, or the types of traffic and types of technologies that are used. But I would like to think that some of the principles, the objectives of what's next in the security absolutely apply. With the Purdue model, with the segmentation of your OT environment, the intent, you could map it to the language of the of these different zero trust maturity models. You could say that those are your trust zones that have been devised such that they are minimizing potential breaches or cross-contamination or flow of information to be done in a certain way. And in a way, ZT takes that to the next level. You continue to reduce those trust zones. You continue to reduce those compartments of traffic flow, while still allow for those exceptions that inevitably end up accumulating over time, right? We've got new challenges that may not have existed 10, 20 years ago, when you've got data collection from a factory floor going to cloud for analytics and some sort of aggregation. So those data paths have to be enabled, and I think those challenges can be addressed with the new ideas that have come up from the zero trust initiatives.
No, thank you. I'll just reading a comment here from the Q&A section, and maybe just you have a few words to say, and then the rest of the panelists can include it as well. Somebody asked whether or not that really, is it a question of whether or not zero trust, and its data-centric approach is really more applicable to traditional IT, or to IT, whereas as OT really is more in line with the traditional IT-based, network-based approaches to security?
So I think ultimately these are all tools that we're sort of inserting into our environments, right? And use the right tool for the right job. When you've got a vendor that needs to come and service your SCADA server, or something of a nature where you don't want to call your support tech team to fly across the world and sort of live in a particular factory for a week. Modern technology allows for those for those exceptions, for those capabilities, right? So why not use them? You just need to make sure that you apply them appropriately and securely. So is all of ZT applicable to OT? Probably not. So if you simply try to compare at a very high level of, is it more appropriate for IT versus OT? Well, okay, perhaps. But is it usable? Is there something that we can get out of it? Is there something that we can apply effectively in OT? I do think so.
No, thank you. It's very, very insightful. Philip, thoughts on OT and IT and ZT?
Yeah, everything Marty said, I broadly agree with, and I think it therefore is a function of, yes, there are things from Zero Trust which are useful for OT. It's just maybe not a, hey, we've done this in IT, let's copy and paste it and take it over to the OT. We have to be incredibly cognizant of things like, hey, if we go above 10 milliseconds, it breaks my process and my factory can't run. Therefore, I can't send the data to the cloud. Or we cannot make unchecked changes because if it causes the production line to stop working, and we don't have made that change, it's not functional. And not being able to have single points of failure, not being able to depend upon some external ICAM or IDP that's OICD or SAML, because it could be a machine that doesn't have any concept of humans in the flow. And so we need to be cognizant of those things, but it very much does still massively benefit from what Zero Trust can deliver. And in fact, I'll give an example, because I was talking to an industrial company the other day, and they said, we have a production process, and we take data from a laptop which has no access to the internet, and we bring it into AWS. We put it through some machine learning once a week, because that's a download, and it spits out a paper form, and then we take that back to our laptop and we change our process. And we basically talked about, well, if we apply Zero Trust to that connection from the laptop to the cloud, we can in real time move that data back and forth without breaking their Purdue model. And for them, or to take that a step back, effectively you're enabling Industry 4.0 and industrial transformation through Zero Trust network transformation. And as we look to innovate more in industry, I think it's crucial to enable that convergence between traditional OT technology with the types of capabilities that we can deliver in IT and from the cloud, et cetera, but in a way that doesn't expose us to those increasing risks. And touching upon the question from Larry, because I think it's a good one, I don't think of it as to whether it's data over here, data over there, network over here, network over there. At the end of the day, what we care about is protecting our applications and data. In fact, I would go as far as say, we do not care about network security at the end of the day. That's just a byproduct. If I want to protect my application and the data, therefore I try to secure the network, I try to secure the devices, I try to secure the things on which my data and applications run. And so this is why we want to be able to implement Zero Trust in a way that enables us to protect our applications and data. You may work slightly differently because data in an OT world is different to an IT world. Maybe you don't need to do, the same levels of obfuscation, et cetera, because integrity is more important than, or less important than integrity in an IT world. And so there definitely are nuances and differences, but I wouldn't say it's one versus the other.
No, I appreciate those comments. Being mindful of time, I won't pull the thread on a lot of that, but very insightful. Thank you. Mark, your thoughts?
I'm going to try to keep this one simple. SimCore, actually, the birth of SimCore 20 years ago came from the OT side of the equation. We transitioned roughly about 10 years ago, primarily because OT would not spend money on security. So if you were asking what the root problem is relative to the OT side of the equation, current and in future, is there is no priority on security, and they have not allocated budget to meet the objectives of those risks. We pulled ripcord on that several years ago because of that. However, we use the same methodology of integrity from manufacturing to IT. While each has their own kind of core value of what they're trying to protect, IT is more of the data and application, where OT is more about uptime, availability, and production and output. The two, do they have overlap relative to Zero Trust? Yes. Is it 100%? Absolutely not. I mean, we don't even, these devices in the OT side of the equation that go into production. I mean, I could throw a couple names out, and I'm sure people on this call would know Allen Bradley and Siemens. The general public, they'd go, who's Allen Bradley? You ask, what's Microsoft? Everyone's going to know that. When these systems go into operation, they're not going into operation like our laptops here of 1 to 2 years. They're going in for a decade. And they're not being touched. And the only thing that they're being monitored and measured for is uptime and availability. And when something fails, as we've seen from our methodology of how we deliver integrities, what changed and how quickly can we remediate it and get it back up online so our productivity is minimally impact. That, I mean, we've lived this. So
No, thank you.
it's the life cycles are very different between OT and IT and kind of the users. There's so many things that are just different. I mean, I get why, and I see, like, Philip made some comments relative to how we can apply zero trust for certain scenarios, but it is not 100% one-to-one mapping between the two.
No, I appreciate that. And I can echo that. I mean, over, 20 plus years of incident response and national level security events, I mean, the mindset is very different when you're talking about things that fall into that OT purview, whether it be manufacturing, finance, healthcare. And it very much is about the idea of if it just will keep working, we will leave it alone. And that, that is the priority.
Don't fix it if it ain't broken.
Precisely. So, Kevin, I'll go to you, and then I'll also pose to you, I'll give you 1 minute to kind of convey any closing remarks or big thoughts, pose questions, what have you, to wrap up the panel. And then I'll go back to Bob and give everybody sort of their final minute. But I'm getting the hook. So, Kevin, happy to hear your thoughts on OT.
Yeah, and I'll keep it very short, Chris. The life cycles are the key. Legacy applications and resources. I'm right now working with an entity to protect a paper tape system, as well as their 40-year-old computational assets that would cost them $500,000 to replace each and every one. And by the time they total it up, they're at $500 million. So you take those numbers right there and you put them to reality. That's not happening. And anybody that goes in and says, yes, you can do it, has never been in the OT space. As to the part of how we can do this, I'm the last presenter today, and my presentation deck is short because I'm really going to walk you through what I've been building here with the team at Ciolo and how we can make this actionable, enforceable, and meet zero trust for people. So I think it's better for people to not do death by PowerPoint, but to see what technology really looks like that can make this happen. So I'll leave it at that for you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it, and look forward to your talk this afternoon. So, Bob, we'll give you 30 seconds to a minute to impart any closing wisdom you might.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the panel. Loved speaking with you all last year, and I really truly enjoy these scenario use cases because it does, I think, force us all to kind of think outside of the box and think of, hey, how would we handle this, this various scenarios. And appreciate the partnership with everybody on the panel. So that's again, looking forward to hopefully the next one.
No, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. Marty, closing thoughts?
With the unmuted microphone. Yes, thank you very much for having me here. This is a journey, like you have said in your opening remarks, right? This is an evolution of technology and security and the tool set behind it. We can discuss, debate benefits and pros and cons of individual aspects of the technology. I think the key is that there is this sort of continued discussion, continued evaluation of new tools, that there is innovation in the space. I think those are all critical for all of us to sort of be able to grow our toolkits, right? And be aware of what's out there. So thank you very much for having us, giving us the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Philip?
Thank you, and likewise, it's a pleasure to talk to everyone and have people who are attending. I think I will say it again. I agree with everything Marty said. I think it really behooves us to talk with the users and the community because we on the panel may be experts in zero trust and have some understanding of industry, but it's the users that really understand their industries and their compliance requirements and their businesses, and it's really coming together and meeting both those requirements, where both of those aspects and views to be able to say, okay, here's how we can apply zero trust, here's how we cannot apply zero trust, here's how we maybe need to consider other tools, other processes, other things. And to be honest, from my perspective, that's one of the most interesting parts of the job.
No, we appreciate your participation and your thoughtful remarks. So thank you. Mark, you get to close.
Two things. Number one, OT and IT cannot be considered in the same, right? They're apples and oranges and two different everything, life cycles, technologies, you name it. But does that mean that OT can't follow the same principles of IT zero trust? Absolutely, they can, but they can't be held accountable to the same standards. This problem relative to where we're at from an IT perspective is solvable. But we have to have common definition, common criteria, and common objectives. And, we all have to be, heading to the same goalposts, essentially. And without that, I'm just afraid we're going to fail again. And we keep failing over decade after decade relative to security. And we have to be innovative in our ability to deliver solutions that map to those requirements.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you to everybody. Your thoughtful comments, your insights, your experience. It's wonderful to be able to bring you all together for forums like this, both from the perspective of your individual presentations, but very much relative to these discussions where we all get a chance to sort of opine and share relative to these shared set of questions and concerns. So thanks to each of you. I will turn it over to Rhonda to probably take us into break and set us up for what comes next.